What's up guys?
How's it, my Bruce?
I hope everyone's doing super good. This tutorial is all about forms, and forms are really important to web development. Every site that you can interact with, there's forms on it. So for example, if we go to Google, let's go here, open inspect tools, and we click on this, on their main input. It's an input and it's in a form. Where is that form? Here. On the cars.co.za website, we have this main thing on the website and it's a form. On Facebook, if you want to log in and they're within a form. Forms are important for signing up, sending messages. The whole message system on LinkedIn, on YouTube is all forms. It's important.
I get it.
Let's get into making one. So this is the form I want to go into making. It has a name field, an email field, a password field. It has a drop down. It has a radio button. It has checkboxes. It has a text area, and it has a date selector. I try to get the elements that you would use most often in most forms, so we can just cover those. There are other elements, but I think these are the main ones. Let's just go to codepen.io, click start coding. Then I changed my view here. You can change your view here. I changed it to this one. I think it's a lot nicer. Cool. So when you're making a form, the first thing you need is a form tag. So we create a form tag and we close it off. With our form inputs, there's the input and there's a label. They're not joined. So first up, we need to create a label and close it off. And this will be for name. Now we need to create the name input field. So in input field, you create it like this with the input tag, and it doesn't have anything within it, so you close it off. Then we can see we've already got one here, but we need to tell the browser what type of input field it is. So we add a type, and because it's a name, it's a text input. So we write text. Cool. Now, there's another thing that we need to do with forms, and that's link the label to the input. And that's really easy. So what we do is we say for as an attribute in the label, and we'll say for name. And now we need to give this input an ID of name. And what that does is that tells the browser that this label is for this input. So we can click on the label and then it will select the input. Pretty cool. We need to give it a name attribute. This is going to get confusing. A name attribute, and the name will be name.
I don't get it.
Now what this does is when we actually use the form and send the data to the server, it will tell the server that the data that we enter into this input is for name. So the server will then read a variable called name and get this data. Then the last thing we can add is a placeholder. And the placeholder could be enter your name. Cool. And as we've learned before, inputs and labels, they don't create new lines. So we can add two breakpoints here just to separate our form a bit nicely. And then we can add the email input. And it goes very similarly. So we go label, and then we close it off. And here it'll be for email. And then the for attribute will be for email. And then what we'll do is we'll create a new input element. But this time we're going to pass through a type of email. And what this will do is it'll allow for functionality on the browser to validate that this is an email, this looks like an email address. And then we can give it the ID of email. Remember, this ID matches this for label. So now we should be able to click name and click email, and it selects them. Then we can add a placeholder of enter your email. I forgot about this. Let's add the name attribute, and we'll call this one email. Then I want to show is a password input, and A password input is handy because it creates the dots where you don't actually see what the user is typing. So we can actually just make this quicker. We just copy and paste this whole thing. And all we have to do to create a password is change the type from email to password. And then that will create the dots. But then we still have to change the label and the IDs and everything else. So this is for password. The ID would be password. The name would be password. And the placeholder would be enter your password. And then let's just change the label text. That's pretty simple, right? So it doesn't look that great, but remember, we're just making the markup. The CSS this will style it and make it look a lot nicer. Next up, I want to just create a select box where you can choose a specific option. So let's just copy these breakpoints so that our form looks a bit better. Try to make your HTML look nice and presentable. Remember, that's like a mark of a good developer is how neat their code is. Cool, so first thing, we need a label. And inside the label, we're gonna write what this is. So let's say choose a car. Cool, and for cars. So the way a select works is it's not an input element, it's rather a select element. So let's create that, a select element, and then we'll close it off. And a select, we also just give it the ID of cars. And remember, this matches the 4 attributes. And a select element, you see it's empty here. A select attribute expects to have option elements within it. And these will be the options that you can select. So for options, we create an option. And you close it off. And you can say BMW. Awesome. And we have the option, but when the user selects it, we still need some data behind it. So what are we going to pass to the server when the user selects this? And that we'll put in the value attribute. And we can say BMW. And let's just also give the select a name, and we'll give it the name of car selection. We'll just say car. And that means the server will then, if you select BMW, the server will get a variable with the name car, and the value would be BMW. So we can copy this a few times. Copy. And if you click on this drop down here and you say format HTML, it'll just line them up. And we can say Fiat, oops, and then Volvo. And then here you should be able to select one of those options. Now let's create a radio box. And a radio box is an input where you can only select one of the available options. It's kind of like a select, but you use it if there's not that many selections. So in the select box, we could have like 10, 20, 30 tons of selections, but in a radio box, you generally have like 1 to 4.
Same, but different.
Let's say payment options. So we'll create a label, close it off, and we'll say payment options. Before I forget, this is going to create it inline. Let's just add some breakpoints above it. Now we're going to do things a bit different. So now what we need is the input element, and then next to it we want the label. So we'll create the input, and we'll close it off. And the type is equal to, radio, and we'll create a label for it. We can say finance. So right now, and let's just also add a breakpoint after this label so it looks a bit better. So right now, this label doesn't do anything, but we can we can select the radio box. So to make it so that when we click the label, the radio input is checked, we have to use that for attribute. So this is for, and we can say finance, and we'll give this the ID of finance. So now when we click this, it checks.
Wow.
Cool. Let's create another one for cash. So input, the type is equal to radio. Give it the ID of cash, and then we'll make the label at the bottom. And we'll say cash. So now the issue is we can actually still check both of these boxes. That's because the browser doesn't know that these radio boxes are for the same value. So what we need to do is give each of those inputs the same name. So we'll say name is equal to finance option, and we'll copy this and we'll put it into the next input. And then can click either one. The other thing that we don't have is these inputs don't actually have values. They have a name, but when we send this data to the server, the browser won't actually know what the value for cash is or what the value for finance is. So we have to add a value attribute here. And this one would be value finance, and in the next one, give it the value of cash. Cool, I hope that makes sense so far. Now I want to add a text area. A text area is where you then normally put a message or something like that. And all you have to do is, let's create new breakpoints. All you have to do is use the text area tag, and then we close it off. And the reason why the text area has a closing tag is because you can actually put some words in here and words in there, and then it'll populate within the text area. But we don't actually want that. So we want an empty one. So we'll clear the contents. And what we'll do is we'll give this a placeholder of please enter your message. And now it'll have that placeholder there. But the text area is really small at the moment. So what we could also do is give it rows. So row is equal to 10, and that'll increase the row length. Then it also needs to have a name, and that could be message, an ID, and you can also give that message. It's good practice to add IDs to elements even if they don't have an attached label to them. And also, if we wanted to make it longer, other than rows, we can also say columns. So cols, and we can make that 30, and that will make it wider. Cool, and that's a text area. The last elements I want to show are a checkbox and a date picker, and then I think we're done for this because it's quite a long tutorial. So to create a checkbox, all we need to do is create an input. Let's copy these spaces again. We create an input, close it off, and the type of this input is checkbox. Then we give it a label. And we can say, I accept the T's and C's. Now we have the same issue as with the radio buttons, where here we can select one of the radio buttons. Here, if we click the label, it doesn't do anything. So we need to use the for attribute, for, and we can say T's and C's. And here we can give it the ID of T's and C's. I also want to say that the order of the attributes in these HTML elements doesn't make a difference. It's also T's and C's. And then we can give this the name of T's and C's. Now let's add another checkbox. So we copy this one and we can put it underneath. And let's put a breakpoint here. And here we can say, I want to subscribe. And we'll change the ID to subscribe. Subscribe, and this would be for subscribe. Now we can select them, deselect them as well. The very last input I want to show is a date input, which just create the breakpoints, which works pretty much like the other inputs. So most inputs work the same, where you just change the type. They are the inputs like the select and the text area, which are a bit different but for the most part, you're going to be using these input elements. Cool, and we'll give this one a label of, let's just say date. And this would be for date, and we'll give our new input the ID of date. And now what we do is we say type is equal to date. And that will give us a date picker. And that's pretty much it for the elements of a form. There's one obvious element missing here, which is we need a button to submit the form. So we'll go button, send, and then the type of this button is a submit button, which submits the form. Let's put a break here as well. 2 breaks. So now I want to show you why it's handy to change the types of the inputs. So we can also add a required flag in these inputs. And what that will do is it will tell the browser, don't submit this form unless these fields have been populated. So if we try to submit the form now, it'll say, please fill in this field. So fill in Daniel. Now, email is required. So if we put garbage in this input, it won't work. It'll say, please include an @ in the email address. It's missing an @. So it knows the structure of email address. So we can say example@test.com. So it's not actually it's not checking to see whether it's a valid email address, because that's not a valid email address, but it's just checking to see that the format of the email address is valid. And that's really handy. The thing is, you don't want somebody posting forms on your website and then you're getting no data on the other end. And that's just junk data. This video is pretty long at the moment, so I just want to cut it off here. There are other things that I want to talk about with forms, but I think this is a good intro to HTML form structure. There's a link to the code pen if you want to just check this out yourself. Let me know if there's anything you found confusing. I'm not really finished with forms just yet. This is just an intro into the inputs and the labels and the kinds of inputs you can get. Thanks guys. Cheers.